In 4 long years of civil war, across hundreds of battles and more than 500,000 dead, one thing almost never happened. Armies were not destroyed. They were beaten, bloodied, driven from the field, forced into retreat, but they survived. The loser of a great battle gathered up its wounded, fell back, licked its wounds, and lived to fight again another day. Gettysburg did not destroy Lee's army. Antietam, the bloodiest single day in American history, did not destroy it either. Even the most catastrophic battles of the war tended to end, with both sides battered but still standing, still armies. That was simply the nature of the thing. A Civil War army was one of the hardest objects on earth, except once. On 2 freezing days in December of 1864, in the hills outside the city of Nashville, a Union general did the thing that 4 years of war had proven was very nearly impossible. He did not merely defeat a Confederate army, he destroyed it. He took the field against one of the 2 great armies of the Confederacy, and when the fighting was over, that army was simply gone. Not retreating, not regrouping, gone as a fighting force for the rest of the war. The man who did it was named George Thomas, and the strangest part of the whole story is that almost no one remembers his name today. This is the story of how, in roughly 48 hours, an entire army ceased to exist. To understand why what happened at Nashville is so extraordinary, you first have to understand why it almost never happened anywhere else. Destroying an army in the open field is one of the hardest things in all of warfare. An army is not a single, fragile object that can be shattered with one good blow. It is tens of thousands of men spread across miles of ground. And even when its line breaks and its soldiers run, most of them simply run faster than the enemy can chase them. The winning army is usually exhausted too, its own ranks thrown into disorder by the sheer effort of victory, its horses blown, its formations tangled. By the time it could organize a real pursuit, the beaten enemy already had a head start, the cover of darkness, and 100 roads to scatter down. So battle after battle ended the same way. One side won the ground, the other side withdrew into the night, and a few weeks later they faced each other again, both of them still armies. It had happened that way again and again across the whole war. Lee had slipped away after his bloodiest defeats with his army bruised but unbroken. Whole campaigns had been fought to an exhausted standstill, and then simply begun again from the beginning. The outright destruction of an enemy army was the thing every general dreamed of in private, and almost none of them ever actually managed to do. To actually destroy an army, several things had to come together at exactly the same moment, and they almost never did. You needed to break the enemy lines so completely that an orderly retreat became a blind panic. You needed a fresh, fast, organized force standing ready to turn that panic into a rout and run the fugitives down before they could possibly reform. And you needed an enemy who, for one reason or another, had nowhere safe left to run. At Nashville, for the first and very nearly the only time in the entire war, all of those things lined up at once. And they lined up precisely because the Union general in command had spent the previous weeks doing the one thing his own superiors had nearly relieved him from command for doing. He had refused to attack until every single piece was exactly, perfectly ready. That refusal, and the firestorm it caused all the way up to the top of the Union command, is a story of its own. What matters here is what that patience finally produced. And before we walk out onto that frozen field, let me be straight with you, because this is exactly the kind of story this channel exists to tell. Nashville is one of the most complete and spectacular victories in all of American military history, and almost no one alive has ever heard of it, because the man who won it never bragged about it and the textbooks simply moved on. We do not move on, we dig these stories back up. So if you want the battles that genuinely mattered told the way they actually deserve, with the real stakes and the real names left in, then stop right here and subscribe, because this is the only thing this channel does. Now, back to the army that arrived at Nashville already half dead. Because the Confederate army that George Thomas faced outside Nashville was not a healthy one, it arrived already broken. Just 2 weeks earlier, its commander, John Bell Hood, had hurled it headlong into a fortified Union line at the town of Franklin in one of the most pointless and catastrophic frontal assaults of the whole war, and it had come away with thousands of dead and 6 of its own generals killed in a single afternoon. That is a story of its own, and a terrible one. But here it is only the context. The point is simply this. The Army of Tennessee that limped up to the gates of Nashville in December of 1864 was a wounded animal. Its finest officers were dead. Its ranks were thinned and frozen and hungry. Many of its men no longer truly believed in the cause they were being asked to keep dying for, and they were deserting into the cold by the hundreds. Picture the condition of that army for a moment, because it shaped everything that came next. Many of the men had no shoes at all, and had wrapped their cracked and bleeding feet in rags against the hard December frost. They were on starvation rations in a countryside that had already been picked clean. They had just watched the regiments and brigades they had fought beside for years be torn to pieces at Franklin, and they had buried 6 of the generals who led them. Men in that condition do not fight the way fresh, confident, well-fed soldiers fight. They hold on out of habit and stubbornness and loyalty to the man standing next to them in the line. And when a body of men worn down that far finally gives way, it does not bend slowly and grudgingly. It snaps all at once. And yet Hood, unable or unwilling to accept what Franklin had already told him in the plainest possible terms, marched the survivors north anyway and sat them down in a thin, overstretched line in the frozen hills south of the city. He was far too weak to storm Nashville. He was too weak even to lay a proper siege. He had brought a dying army to the doorstep of a much larger and far better supplied one, and then he had simply stopped and waited, as though hoping that something, anything, might change in his favor. Thomas commanded perhaps 55,000 men. Hood had something closer to 30,000, and many of those were barely able to stand. What was coming for that frozen line was not just a battle. It was the most carefully prepared killing stroke of the entire war. And Thomas had taken his time, at real risk to his own career, to make absolutely certain it would land. When the sheet of ice that had locked down the ground for days finally began to thaw, Thomas struck. And the plan he unleashed on the morning of December the 15th was a thing of cold, deliberate precision, the kind of plan that only a methodical mind could have designed and only patient preparation could have executed. He did not intend simply to throw his larger army at Hood's smaller one and trust to sheer weight. He set a trap inside the attack itself. First, he sent a strong, noisy assault against the Confederate right, loud and committed enough to convince Hood that the main blow was falling there, enough to fix the Confederate commander's attention and pull his thin reserves in that direction. That attack on the right, around a piece of high ground, was real, and it was bloody, and it largely failed, which was almost the point, because while Hood was staring to his right, Thomas swung the true weight of his army against the Confederate left. Wave after wave of Union infantry rolled against that flank, overrunning the small earthwork forts the Confederates had thrown up to anchor it, and behind and around the infantry came the thing that made Nashville feel less like 1864 and more like a war that had not been invented yet. The cavalry, the Union horsemen at Nashville, were commanded by a young and aggressive general named James Wilson, and they were not the light scouting cavalry of the early war. Wilson had assembled an enormous mounted force, many thousands strong, and a great number of those troopers carried the Spencer repeating carbine, a weapon that could fire 7 shots before reloading at a time when most infantrymen on both sides still rammed a single round at a time down the muzzle of their rifle. These cavalrymen did not trot up, fire one volley, and wheel away as horsemen had always done. They climbed down off their horses and fought as shock infantry with the firepower of a force several times their actual size, and then they used their horses to move faster than any foot soldier ever could, swinging wide and deep around the enemy's flank. It was a brief, sharp glimpse of a kind of war that would not fully arrive for another half-century, massed firepower on the move used as a hammer rather than a scout. And at Nashville, that hammer came down squarely on Hood's exposed and outnumbered left. For the Confederate soldiers holding that flank, it must have been a bewildering kind of horror. They were used to gauging an enemy attack by the volume of its fire, judging how many men were coming at them by how fast the muzzles flashed in the smoke. Against Wilson's troopers, that old arithmetic simply broke down. A single dismounted cavalryman with a Spencer could throw out the fire of half a squad of ordinary infantry, and there was no pause to it, no reloading gap to rush forward into, only a continuous, rolling wall of lead pouring out of men who would then swing back up onto their horses and reappear somewhere else entirely. They were being beaten by a weapon that the future had not quite finished inventing. Through that first day, the Confederate left was driven back, bent nearly double, and battered. But it did not quite shatter. In the freezing dark, Hood pulled his survivors back across the fields and formed a new, shorter, more desperate line on a fresh set of hills. And he waited there for the second day, still stubbornly refusing to do the one sensible thing left to him, which was to retreat while he still had an army to retreat with. The second day, December the 16th, finished him. Thomas renewed the pressure all along the front, holding the Confederates in place, and then once again he sent his decisive blow crashing against Hood's left, against a steep and exposed hill on the Confederate left, a place that the maps would ever afterward mark with the name of the young colonel who was killed defending it. And while the infantry hammered that hill from the front, Wilson's cavalry curled all the way around it and got into the Confederate rear. This is the geometry that kills an army. A line attacked hard in the front and the flank at the same time can sometimes, with luck and discipline, still hold. But an army that suddenly discovers enemy cavalry behind it, sitting astride the only road it has left to escape on, almost never can. Late in the afternoon, in a cold gray drizzle, the Confederate left simply gave way, and the collapse spread down the entire line like a crack racing across a frozen pond. And this is the exact moment when Nashville became the thing the war had almost never produced. Because when Hood's line broke, it did not break the way beaten armies usually broke. It did not fall back in sullen, stubborn order to fight again somewhere down the road. It came apart completely. The retreat turned into a panic, and the panic turned into a full rout, thousands of men flinging away their rifles and their packs and running south through the freezing mud and the failing light, every man for himself. And waiting for precisely this collapse was the one ingredient that almost every other battle of the entire war had lacked: a fresh, fast, organized pursuit already positioned in the enemy's rear. Wilson's cavalry did not give the broken army a single moment to gather itself back together. They rode it down. They harried the fleeing, disintegrating columns for days on end, scooping up prisoners by the thousand, seizing guns and wagons and flags, giving the shattered Confederates no chance at all to stop, catch their breath, and turn back into an army. In a war where a beaten enemy almost always slipped clean away in the night, this beaten enemy did not get away at all. The roads south were strewn with the wreckage of a force coming apart at the seams. Cannon sunk to the axle in the freezing mud, abandoned wagons, and men who had simply sat down in the dark and given themselves up. By the time the last exhausted survivors finally staggered across the Tennessee River and out of reach, the Army of Tennessee was no longer an army at all. It was a long, broken column of starving, frostbitten men. One of the two great field armies of the entire Confederacy, the army that had fought and bled at Shiloh and Chickamauga, and through the whole long agony of the Atlanta campaign, the army that had carried the war across the western half of the continent for 3 years had been destroyed as a fighting force in roughly 2 days, and it would never again function as a real army for the remainder of the war. Hood resigned his command the following month. By then, there was very little left for anyone to command, and here, underneath all of it, sits the quiet irony that gives the whole story its weight. The single most complete and annihilating victory of the entire Civil War was not won by the boldest general, or the fastest, or the most famous. It was won by the most patient one. The very deliberateness that had nearly gotten George Thomas removed from command in disgrace, the slowness that his own superiors found almost unbearable, was the precise reason that his victory was total instead of merely large. He had refused to move until he could do more than win. He had waited until he could destroy, and then, with a cold and methodical thoroughness, he had destroyed. It remains one of the rarest things in the whole history of American arms. A battle that did not simply defeat an army but ended one, that did not push an enemy off the field but erased him from it. And the deeper question underneath that rarity, the question of what it truly takes to make an entire army cease to exist on a single piece of frozen ground, and how few times in all of war it has ever really happened, is a story all its own.